All right, aloha mai kako. My name is Brianna Govea, Curator of Collections and Programs here at the King Kamehameha Fifth Judiciary History Center. I'd like to mahalo you all for joining us this afternoon to dive into some compelling yet little known history covered in our new collaborative exhibit here behind me, Kaulike no Nā Mea Apau, Toward Queer Justice in Hawaii. And I also want to mahalo our great partners on this project at Lei Pua ʻAla, Queer Histories of Hawaiʻi, for making the exhibit possible. In honor of Honolulu Pride, this past October is when we debuted, and it is the first interpretation of its kind ever to go up in a Liʻiolani Hale, our capital building of the Hawaiian Kingdom, and today home to the Hawaii Supreme Court. So the exhibit is still on display here downtown Honolulu, but we also have digital versions of the banners accessible on our website. I'm going to quickly throw that link in the chat for those of you who may not be able to visit us in person. There you go. You should see it in the chat. Before I turn it over to our guests, I want to mahalo Chief Justice Mark E. Rechtenwald and the Hawaii State Judiciary for providing space for our conversation. This program is being recorded and will be posted on our YouTube channel tomorrow. We should have time at the end of the discussion to take audience questions as well here over Zoom. So I invite you to use the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen to send in questions at any time. You should see a little comment bubble with a question mark. So please feel free to use that throughout the program to send in your questions. Now, to shed more light on Hawaii's LGBTQ plus Mahu community, civil rights, and legal history, it's my great honor to introduce and welcome our distinguished panelists here this afternoon. Kanaka Maoli historian Adam Keawe Manalo-Camp joins us, along with Maui attorney, author, and filmmaker Lance D. Collins, Molokaʻi attorney Karen M. Holt, and co-director of Lei Pua ʻAla Queer Histories of Hawaiʻi, Dean Hamer. I do want to mention Dean is also co-curator of the exhibit, along with Joe Wilson of Lei Pua ʻAla and the Judiciary History Center's team here, including myself, our Executive Director, Matt Matisse, Education Director, Keahe Davis, and we're grateful for the many others who contributed to the research in this exhibit. Each speaker will have about 10 minutes to present on their different topics regarding this history, and I'd like to welcome Adam to begin this conversation with laying the Hawaiian cultural and historical background for us and share some really incredible insight about the reign of King Kamehameha III. So mahalo, Adam, please take it over.
Aloha. Mahalo for having me. Let me put on my PowerPoint. Okay. Can everyone still hear me?
Yes, all good.
Okay. So, why is this? Sorry, 1 second. There we go. So today I'm going to talk about the time of Kaomi. So the 1820s and the 1830s marked a time of identity crisis for Kanaka Maoli. Amidst the overthrow of the traditional Hawaiian religion and the imposition of a missionary-led societal order. Kamehameha III grew up in the new religion of Christianity, and Kahumanu governed as Kuhina Nui in the system. Kaomi, who we'll get more into a little bit later, but the background of Kaomi was that Kaomi was the child of Jack Moy, a Maohi or Tahitian from Bora Bora, and a Kanaka Maoli woman named Kahua Moa, also known as Naomi Moy. Kahua Moa was attached to the court of Kahumanu and taught chiefly households on Maui. In 1822, Reverend William Ellis from the London Missionary Society arrived with several Maohi Christian converts, including Auna, Hokeda, and others. These Maohi converts were instrumental in the spread of Christianity and the development of the written Hawaiian language. Tokeda is actually the first one to write correspondence in the Hawaiian language, by the way. The role of Maui in this phase of the Hawaiian kingdom is, often overlooked. And in particular, it's very underwritten about. But Auna, who was a Raiatea chief, was the brother-in-law of Jack Moy and became a confidant of Kahumanu. By 1826, Kaomi became a pupil of Reverend Hiram Bingham on Oahu and was noted for his intelligence. He was actually a star pupil and was thought to be someone who could potentially become a preacher or a pastor one day. Kaomi became close to Oahu Governor Kama'ule'ule, also known as Boki, and was skilled in la'au lapa'au. And he was also, by the way, a very good hula dancer. It is through Boki that Kaomi is introduced to Kamehameha III. By this time, Kamehameha III is still in his teens. He's about like 14, 15. And Kaomi is about slightly older than him. Boki and Liliha are part of the Catholic ali'i that includes Kalanimoku. They are part of an internal struggle between Calvinist and Catholic ali'i. And that's another topic that is often overlooked, is the struggle between Catholic and Calvinist ali'i within the court. Kaomi represents yet another internal struggle between the Maui missionaries who had adopted Anglicanism and who were culturally more similar to Kanaka Maoli versus their American Calvinist missionary counterparts. Kahumanu begins to pass laws based upon the Bible. Around 1832, Kahumanu passes away. However, before she passes away, the relationship between Kaomi and Kamehameha III is fully well known. It's very public, and she tries to end that relationship. However, Kamehameha III refuses to end the relationship and retorts, "Let me work at hard labor as the law that I have made for my kingdom says." So in other words, he decides he would rather do hard labor than to give up his relationship with Kaomi. And Kamehameha III is forced to build a cattle fence for Hiram Bingham. Around this time, young Kanaka Maoli male chiefs begin to rebel against the missionaries. So they began to have a prominent presence in Waialua, Oahu. Waialua is significant because it is home to several sacred sites, including Kapuka Puakea Heao and Mahuka Heao, which overlooks Lania Kea, Raiatea and Tahitian. Is also famous for a place of Lua. And here we have a quote from Hiram Bingham. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but in the quote, he talks about several of these young men, Paki, Naumu'u, Kaomi, and others who had begun to reject the Calvinist form of religion. And they began to, as he says here, they declared he tried religion and found nothing in it. So that's a rather bold statement. Now, the goals of the Calvinist missionaries were not only to spread their version of Christianity, but to make Kanaka Maoli into their own image. This includes, imposing Western notions of gender, heteronormative relationships, patriarchy, and the nuclear family. And all of these ideas are very radically different from Hawaiian ideas, from indigenous native Hawaiian ideas. As Laura Judd says, that one of the goals of the missionaries was to help these degraded beings up and out of the depths of heathenism, to teach them how to become better wives, better mothers, better neighbors, and is indeed a work that angels coveted, especially when these efforts seem to be accepted of God and are crowned by success. Now, prior to the missionaries, chiefly Kanaka Maoli engaged in polyamorous relationships, and Mahu and Aikane, same-gender relationships, were normal. These things were now outlawed in the Christian-inspired laws that Kauman had just given, and things like hula, tattooing, surfing, and that type of those types of Hawaiian traditions were all now banned. Now, upon the passing of Kahumanu, Elizabeth Kina'u becomes Kuhina Nui. Kamehameha III is still, too young to rule on his own. He's maybe about 17, 18. Kamehameha III then declares that Kaomi is his Mōʻī Kuʻi, or joint ruler. Kamakau explains that when the king, here's a quote from Kamakau. He explains that when Kaomi becomes the joint ruler, they appoint chiefs, warriors, and guards to his service, and made his name, honorable. In other words, he began to have a retinue. He began to have his own court. And as Kamakau notes, people who didn't have money, who needed help, who did not have land, they came to Kaomi. So Kaomi and Kamehameha III effectively had their own power base. It was also a court that embraced indigenous beliefs and posed a serious challenge to the Christian-inspired court in Lahaina. Oops. They also pushed for the regulation of Catholic missionaries, alcohol, and smuggling. They also wanted to relax laws around moi kolohe. So moi kolohe is a legal term that covers a lot of behavior that the missionaries did not approve of. This ranged from premarital sex to polygamy to prostitution. In 1833, Kamehameha III declared that he was of age to rule without a regent. This threatened not only Kuhina Nui Kina'u, but the missionary establishment itself. It should also be noted that Catholic chiefs like Liliha at this time was governor of Oahu. She began her governorship in 1829 when Boki disappeared. And she was one of the most vocal supporters of Kamehameha III and Kaomi. So again, there is this internal struggle between Protestant and Catholic ali'i that plays out within the relationship between Kaomi and Kamehameha III. So there was also a rumor that Liliha was going to be appointed as the new Kuhina Nui. Nahi Ena, who is the sister of Kamehameha III and who had a relationship with him previously, sees Kamehameha III about the relationship between him and Kaomi. Again, she urges him to end the relationship. He refuses. So, not coincidentally, the Hulu Manu, the group of young chiefly men who are now, in Waialua doing their thing, they began to be more open about it. And you can see that they're having, they're drinking a lot, they're having fun in the valley. But they're also, if you notice the quote here from Laura Judd, family ties were surrendered, husbands forsook their wives, and wives left husbands and helpless little children. In other words, they were also challenging the new nuclear family setup that the missionaries were establishing. Now, this comes to a boil about a year later. At this time, Kauai Governor Kaiki O'Eva and other Protestant chiefs managed to kidnap Kaomi. Instead of resisting and potentially causing more violence within the kingdom, Kaomi allowed himself to be bound and potentially be put to death. They actually go to Kaomi's house with a war club, and they might have beat him. It's not really sure, depends on the source. But at any rate, they bring Kaomi to Fort Kekua Noho, which is why 4th Street in Honolulu is named 4th Street. And they present Kaomi to Kina'u. They want her to sentence him to death and announce that she is the sole ruler. Kamehameha III is able to save Kaomi, luckily, because at this time Kina'u was very hesitant to go against her brother, her half-brother, and she, for the credit of Kina'u, she actually didn't really want to be Kuhina Nui, but she was kind of pressed into becoming Kuhina Nui because because she represented the Protestant missionary, ali'i. So she's the Kuhina Nui, but she refuses to become the ruler alone. And so Kamehameha III is able to get Kaomi out of her custody, and together, Kamehameha III and Kaomi, they go on a circuit around the kingdom to try to assert the king's authority. However, there's rumors of a coup against Kamehameha III. People, particularly who are aligned with the Protestant elite, say, well, Kamehameha I, he has a lot of children still. We can easily replace this one with another one. So they go on this circuit. Kamehameha III reappoints Elizabeth Kina'u as Kuhina Nui, and eventually he acquiesced to missionary pressure. And what happens is Kaomi actually leaves Kamehameha III, so that way his crown may endure. Kaomi, from my understanding, or what I read into the sources, is he is actually the one who leaves Kamehameha III because he's worried about the physical safety of the king, but also he wants the king to continue to be king. By 1836, Kaomi passes away in Lahaina alone. Now, what happens is a year after Kaomi passes away in 1836, so 1837, um, well, in 1837, Kamehameha III marries the missionary selected Kalama Hakaleleponi. And you begin to see this radical, change within the kingdom. Now, following the marriage, you see Kamehameha III, he grants an edict of toleration, and in the following year, he grants a constitution. This effectively marks the transition towards towards more westernized forms of governance and laws, but also cements the power of Protestant elite and Calvinist missionaries. Now, despite the vilification of Kaomi, which is always there, the time of Kaomi, marked a significant indigenous to uh, response and resistance to cultural assimilation. Kaomi also represented an alternative vision of what a Hawaiian nation could look like. Now, the era of Kaomi also symbolizes broader indigenous resilience and the broader struggle against colonial impositions. Not to mentions, it debunks the more mainstream narrative that all Hawaiians just became Christian and that we just transitioned very easily from being an indigenous kingdom to that of a more westernized form of governance based upon the US and UK models. But in actuality, there was a lot of resistance to the missionaries, and there was a lot of resistance towards going towards that form of governance. The erasure economy also demonstrates the erasure of Mahu and LGBTQ historical figures, as well as same-gender relationships from mainstream historiography. I also just wanted to note that this lack of a queer lens is also why we need to have more queer historians, anthropologists, and we need to look more carefully on narratives like Kaomi. Other than that, thank you for allowing me this time to talk about Kaomi, and I'll turn it over back to you folks.
Mahalo, Adam. I'd like to call Lance to carry on the conversation after the time of Kaomi. I believe you have some specific stories to share prior to the 1985 Molokaʻi Pageant that Karen will speak about. So Lance, go ahead.
Yes, aloha, and thank you. So I have to cover about 150 years worth of history in 10 minutes. So it's definitely not complete. I just want to focus on certain things that exemplify certain parts of Hawaii's history at certain times. So I apologize if I miss something or I focus on something that you feel I shouldn't. So I just want to say that up front, I have a lot to cover in a short period of time. So after the time of Kaomi, in 1839, the Declaration of Rights was implemented, the Kekumu Kanawai, and then in 1840, an actual constitution was adopted. And shortly thereafter, in 1841, a law was adopted regarding lewdness. So all lewd conversations, all seductive language, and all lascivious conduct leading to lewdness, and all libidinous solicitations, and any other species of lewdness that's committed, but not specifically mentioned by the law, would be punished as a crime. And then in 1850, a penal code was adopted. This was the same year that the Masters and Servants Act, which allowed indentured servitude and basically created the labor framework for the plantations that came after, were adopted. And sodomy was specifically outlawed in 1850, and it could be punished up to 20 years and a $1,000 fine. That was readopted or recodified in 1876, which of course is when by the laws of Hawaii, to include a lesser included offense, which was called assault to commit sodomy, because of a problem, I guess, in the common law with you either committed sodomy or you didn't, and you couldn't attempt it, right? It's a little bit confusing. Okay, so something happened in 1860, which is actually reported in the Hawaiian reports. I'm only going to mention this. It's interesting, and I believe there's some historians on the continent that are looking into this a little bit more, but there are two cases, Anos versus Sowell, and Vieira versus Sowell, 2 Hawaii 332, 2 Hawaii 345, and 2 Hawaii 346. And so in what basically the gist is the same for these, both of these stories. Anos and Vieira were cabin boys on an American ship called the Montreal, and Captain Nathaniel Sowell was alleged to have attempted to commit sodomy upon both of these young men. And they supposedly both resisted. So anyways, Anos, he escaped in California when it docked in California, but then somehow ended up getting brought back on board when the Montreal visited Lahaina. And then they went to the Pacific Northwest, and Sowell apparently was alleged to have succeeded in committing the crime of sodomy again. And then when they got to Honolulu, Anos deserted, and then somehow, I don't know how this is possible, but somehow the ship was in Japan, and so was Anos, and so he was recaptured or retaken onto the Montreal, and they went on another North Pacific trip where Anos was, quote, was again compelled by Sowell to submit to his unnatural embraces and desires. Okay, well, a similar thing also happened to Vieira, which is reported a few pages later. And they were suing for damages. And so in the first case, the Hawaii Supreme Court ruled that even though Anos was subject of Portugal and Sowell was an American and the ship was American, that in fact, Hawaii does have maritime jurisdiction over these kinds of issues that occur in the high sea. So then in the second case, they basically said that Anos was a youth of tender years and fragile frame. They voided his contract as a cabin boy, and they awarded him $2,500 in damages. For Vieira, they said, quote, that he was of somewhat more mature age and of a stronger frame. They still voided his cabin boy contract, and they only awarded him $1,500 in damages. So did all of this happen? I don't know, because shortly thereafter, Sowell wrote to the newspaper of the time and said that these guys were part of a mutiny and that this was this whole way of smearing him and getting out of possibly being charged with mutiny. And when he published the log of the Montreal a few years later in New England, it was very clear that the men on his ship multiple times had tried to mutiny. and that it does sound like that's possibly what happened. Now, was there a same-sex desire experience that also went on all of this? I don't know, because it's not in the archives I was able to look at. It's certainly not in the Hawaiian reports. Under the Hawaiian reports, Sal was basically had to pay damages, and the contracts were voided because of sodomy. Okay, now fast forward to 1898, Republic versus Edwards, 11 Hawaii 571. Edwards challenged that his accomplice, Kui, he was charged with sodomy and convicted. So he challenged that his accomplice, Kui, was the only witness to provide direct evidence about his crime of committing sodomy, and that it was uncorroborated. And in Hawaii, as an exception to the common law, the law in Hawaii at the time required the testimony of a raped woman to be corroborated by another witness. And so he said, well, this should apply to sodomy. And he also made some arguments, too, that he was convicted under Republic law and not US law. And there were some infirmities with that having to do with the composition of the jury and how he was indicted. That was all disregarded. And they also said, no, for sodomy, you don't need to have a corroborating witness. So they upheld his conviction. However, or sustained his conviction. However, 2 years later, in Ex parte Edwards, 13 Hawaii 32, the Hawaii Supreme Court actually vacated his conviction and deemed his detention to be illegal on a habeas corpus petition. And they ruled that it had to be tossed out because he had not been indicted by a grand jury, which was required by the US Constitution. Strange, but this is the life of sodomy in our Hawaii reports. Okay, Territory versus Chi Shu, 25 Hawaii 814. The Hawaii Supreme Court ruled that the emission of semen was not required to prove sodomy. They called that a morbid rule from early English cases that Hawaii would not follow. Also in the next year, 1922, Territory versus Wilson, they ruled that oral sex was a crime against nature. Okay. Very interesting case. This was at the end of World War II, Territory versus Gora. This case is reported in the Hawaii Reports 37 Hawaii 1. It was affirmed by the Ninth Circuit at 152 F. 2nd 933, and cert was denied at 328 U.S. 862. So Gora was a former Waialua high school teacher, and he had previously been involuntarily hospitalized a number of times. And this is in the newspapers. This was not in the Hawaii Reports. During World War II, he ran a boarding house downtown, and a naval patrolman named Arthur Notikai went to his establishment looking for a room, supposedly. And he was actually working with Honolulu Police Department. So Gora took him to a room, unbuttoned his pants, and fondled him. And so he was convicted of lewd and lascivious conduct, and Gora appealed to the Ninth Circuit, saying that the statute was vague and overbroad, and also violated equal protection grounds. But the conviction was sustained, and the US Supreme Court declined to hear his appeal. In 1949, there was a new disorderly conduct law that was adopted to include persons who frequent or loiter any public place soliciting men for the purpose of committing a crime against nature or other lewdness. So I think that involved male prostitution, but yeah. And then in 1958, in Territory versus Bell, 43 Hawaii 23, the Hawaii Supreme Court ruled that sodomy could be charged to a person regardless of the sex of the sexual partner. And they rejected the constitutional challenge, and they said, quote, much criticism of making a crime out of a homosexual or other unnatural sexual relations, this criticism being particularly widespread in England at this time, but the remedy, if any, is a matter for the legislature. Okay, so in 1972, there was very significant judicial reforms in Hawaii, and part of that was the reform and modernization of the Penal Code, which was Act 9 of the 1972 session laws. Included the adoption of the model penal code abolished common law crimes against adult consensual sexual activity, and the age of consent for sexual activity was 16 years or older, but sexual contact, the age of consent was 14 years or older. Okay, and I'm going to skip ahead of Karen time-wise. I know I'm almost out of time, but I'm going to, well, before I get to that, I want to end that story, so I'm going to have to, but I want to mention Arnie Shulo, who lived in Maui. He moved to Maui in 1976, and he worked as an early education instructor at Maui Community College. He's actually one of the co-founders of the Maui gay rap group, which gave way to both sides now, and I think it's now called Aloha Pride Maui, but it was the original sort of LGBT community group in Maui. After a year on his job at MCC, Arnie was not included on the rehire list for the subsequent academic year, and his department chair told him that the provost did not want to rehire him because he was gay. So his department chair resigned, and then Mōʻī Keha, who was the provost at the time, said that her decision was based on her religious beliefs as a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. So the ACLU took Arnie's case with the help of then attorney Joel August, who eventually became a circuit court judge in Maui, and they filed suit against Maui Community College and the Board of Regents in the federal district court on the basis that the termination infringed upon his First Amendment and equal protection constitutional rights. And they sought to prevent the University of Hawaii from further discrimination against gays and lesbians. But there were no anti-discrimination laws protecting against adverse employment actions at that time. So anyways, Arnie worked for about a year at Peahi School, which was a preschool on the North Shore in Maui, and with the assistance of food stamps. And then he, when the quick resolution didn't happen, he moved to San Francisco and worked on his PhD. And he also helped found the Sisters of Perpetual Indulgence. And he took the vocational name with the sisters as Sister Marie Eveready. In 1982, the University of Hawaii agreed to settle Arnie's case by hiring him for 3 years with a minimum of 6 credits per semester and $5,000 in back wages. And Arnie's attorney, Judge August, said, "I would like to think that the university would be much more susceptible now to demands of the community for a statement of non-discrimination based on sexual preference." Okay, so that's in 1982. But it actually wasn't until 1991 that Hawaii added sexual orientation to the list of protected categories in employment and housing discrimination, when John Waihee, who was then governor, signed Act 2 into law. And it found that it was contrary to national and state public policies to allow discrimination in employment merely because of a person's sexual orientation, whether or not such orientation is immutable or voluntary. And I just want to mention that testimony and support also came from the Roman Catholic Church, the United Methodist Church, the United Church of Christ, and the Hawaii Council of Churches. And Leon Rouse, who I know is a very controversial figure in many places, was instrumental actually over this decade in getting these anti-discrimination laws passed. Okay, so just to round out, because I know I've gone over by a minute or two, in 1986, Act 314 was adopted, which lowered the age of sexual consent to 14 years old. And then in 2001, Act 1 of the second special session increased the age of sexual consent back to 16 years with the restricted okay for 14 and 15-year-olds to be involved in to be able to consent to sexual activity if the partner is not more than 5 years old. So there's a lot more. Sorry, that's all I could cover in the time I had. And I hope you found it interesting. And much of it is listed in the exhibit. There's stuff that isn't, but it's in the Hawaii reports. And there's a lot more. So hopefully you'll stay engaged and you find this interesting. Thank you.
Mahalo, Lance. We always appreciate your succinct legal overview of Hawaii's packed history. And I do want to remind our audience again that this is being recorded. So you will be able to review and write notes. Tomorrow it will be up in case any of those cases jumped out at you and you'd like to do some more research. So I'd like to pass it over to Karen to actually talk about her personal experience involving the 1985 Miss Gay Molokaʻi Pageant. All right, Karen, take it away.
Aloha mai kākou. I'm really honored to be part of this discussion. Sex in ancient times, as Adam has explained, was a whole different thing. It wasn't constrained by all of the moral strictures and the rules that especially the Calvinist missionaries brought. But if you go back in time and you do the research that Adam has certainly done, you know that culturally this sex was just not a hot button political issue. So I'd like to start by reading a quote from Kawena Pukui, who, as we all know, wrote Nana Ike Kumu and Olida no Iao. So she was immersed in ancient Hawaiian culture. And this is what she said about sex. I believe that if you really feel Hawaiian, if in your bones you are Hawaiian, then you'll enjoy intercourse without constraint and with fulfillment. You'll know le'a, which was slang for sex, as your ancestors did. It's natural, it's beautiful and satisfying, and it's just lots of fun. And this was in 1972 that she said this. I think that ancient cultural understanding of human pleasure is one that is still part of the culture, especially in places like Molokaʻi. Our population here is 65% Native Hawaiian. And although with social media and all the modern conveniences, people have definitely started to have to change their perspective on a lot of issues. I think that sex is still not perceived in the same way necessarily that the missionaries hoped that they could ensure it would be perceived from now until time immemorial. So I'm one of the two attorneys. Dan Foley, who was at the ACLU at the time, was really the lead on this. So the story of the gay pageant on Molokaʻi was this. I was working at legal aid in that year. I was the only full-time lawyer on the island, so I got inquiries from all kinds of people about all kinds of things. And one day, Kumuhula Billy Ka'aihui walked in to our front door, and he was really upset. So I sat down with him, and he explained that he was trying to do a fundraiser for his hula hala, and that he had gotten a permit to do it at the Kanaka Maoli ballpark. But then Mayor Tavares decided that he wasn't going to continue to allow the permit, so he revoked it. This seemed to me to be a pretty clear First Amendment violation. So I was able to contact Dan at the ACLU, and he agreed to help to take the case. And, you know, we litigated it, and the mayor was, I'm sorry, not the mayor, but the judge who heard the case was Hiram Fong, a Republican. And after he heard the arguments, he ordered the mayor to issue the permit because to fail to issue the permit was a violation of the First Amendment. And then the pageant was held. It was held in the ballpark on a Thursday. At least 500 people attended it. We had some old friends who were actually TV anchors who came and emceed the event. And it was well received, fun, and I don't think that there was any real backlash in the local community about it. The protests against this pageant, which were covered ad nauseum in the Hawaii press, were led by Christian ministers who I suspect meant well. They were following, you know, what they had learned, but they weren't from here. And if you talk to Molokaʻi people about, you know, that protest, they weren't happy about it, but they were able to compartmentalize it because these people were not part of really Molokaʻi culture. So there were no adverse consequences from all of this, and the display that I think is at the Judiciary now that actually posts a number of the newspaper articles. Sadly, for the folks who are looking for it bleeds, it leads. The gay pageant on Molokaʻi did not lead. In fact, people had a really good time. And I would like to kind of backtrack a little bit because, you know, Adam's talked about, you know, the ancient culture. And I read a quotation from Kawena Pukui. But this island, as I mentioned previously, is 65% Native Hawaiian. And there are family ties all over the place. If you're not blood related to somebody, probably somebody married somebody else from another family. And I do think that that's probably the global solution to all kinds of discrimination. And Hawaii leads the way because, you know, we all have, most of us at least, who grew up here, have chop suey ancestry. And so if you want to discriminate against somebody, you better watch out because you might have a cousin or an ancestor who is actually labeled as whatever the unpopular label is today. So when I was asked by Lance to do this, I actually started talking to folks who had been to the pageant and trying to ask them, why do you think Molokaʻi is different? And their answer was pretty consistent, and that is, just to repeat, almost every family here either has LGBTQ members, or they have friends whose families have somebody who identifies that way. You can't really get along in a small community if you decided that you're going to be militant about what people should and should not be doing. I should mention that the ministers who led the protests are long gone. So I think they weren't that comfortable with things that this community was comfortable with. Mahu on Molokaʻi when I first got here, and I'm from Honolulu, so we had Mahu in school with us. It never was a big deal. I'm sure that there was discrimination outside of school, but I never saw or heard anything of it in the public schools that I went to, from elementary school all the way to high school. And I think that, again, is a residual from our local culture, which is founded on the historic behavior of the host culture, the original people here. Mahu here were not only accepted, but they were also leaders in the community. There's a great picture of one of our most famous Mahu. He was a kumuhula also. His name was Maurice Durawa, but he went by Butchie, and his kumuhula name was Moana. And as the display says, he received the Aloha Spirit Award from the Molokai Chamber of Commerce, which at the time was dominated by a whole bunch of banking people and folks who ordinarily would not be looked at as likely to support this kind of behavior. Today, the community is alive and well, and again, I don't see any evidence of discrimination here. And the trans community here is also very active, planning events. So essentially, this isn't Shangri-La or, whatever. But I think this community has something to teach, in that the guiding principle here really is the primary value that the kupuna here will say everybody should be honoring. And that is pretty simple. It's aloha ke kahi I ke kahi. And it's essentially the golden rule. You need to be kind and compassionate, treat other people the way that you want them to treat you. And so aloha is kind of a well-worn term that most of us learned as hello and goodbye. And on Molokaʻi, sometimes it means goodbye more than it does hello. However, I think aloha ke kahi I ke kahi is, to me at least, one of the philosophical foundations of how we look at sex. It's enjoyable. It's not something that's constrained by a bunch of rules. And, studies, by people in later times have shown that, as Pukui says, it was just lea or lea, fun. And so I really hope that we're learning, and that as time goes by, more and more people are going to begin to realize that this is a silly side issue, because that's always been my opinion. And I'm very thankful that I was part of all of the process to try to allow that gay pageant to happen back in the 80s, because it reaffirmed the value system that we have here, which is we're all family, we need to get along, we shouldn't be picking on each other for things that are out of our control and are not really harmful, assuming that everybody is doing whatever they're doing with aloha. Anyway, mahalo.
Thank you so much, Karen. We did have one question come in just to clarify the Mary Kawena Pukui quote. Karen, where was that referenced, or where can others look if they'd like to read more into the quote and the context?
I can look it up before we hang up, hopefully, but it was in a book that she co-authored with Hartig and Lee in 1972. And I will try to find that, and if I can find it, I will either put it in the chat or I'll reopen my microphone.
Okay.
Page 98, if you guys find it before me.
Thank you, Karen. All right, I'd like to pass it on to Dean to finish us off about Hawaii's unique perspective on gender and sexual diversity, as well as the efforts that they're doing over at Lei Pua ʻAla to preserve our queer history here. So Dean, please go ahead.
Thanks very much, Bree. And I just wanted to start by thanking the other three speakers so much for the stories that you shared. Those are exactly the sort of histories that Lei Pua ʻAla project is trying to uncover and to document, and then to lift up and to make better known, because they're important stories, and ultimately to really mark them on the landscape here in Hawaii. We were really excited when we started talking with the Judiciary History Center about this exhibition. I think that it's really a great way to approach history. Laws are important, and in queer histories, they're often the only records that we have, because in the past, when it was illegal to be LGBT, our stories weren't being recorded in the newspapers or in books or in novels. And sometimes arrest records or court records are the only records that we have. And it's sad, but it's one way to better understand what people's lives were like. Laws are also important because they reflect general attitudes and judgments and the way that people are viewed. And they're important because they affect our lives. When I first came out, I could have been put in jail for being gay. And so that has a really profound impact on people's lives. We are also especially interested in doing this exhibition because we wanted to cover the full stretch of time from very early times, pre-contact in Hawaii, up through colonization, up through the territorial period and plantation era, through World War II, through statehood, through marriage, and all the way up to the present time, because often it seems like queer histories of Hawaii skip from old times up to marriage. But there was a lot that happened in between, as you heard from Lance, that really had a profound impact. So I wanted to take some time first to talk about one aspect of queer history in Hawaii that hasn't been much talked about, that I think is really quite astonishing, and that is the HIV/AIDS era, and then to return and talk a little bit about how these stories are going to be permanently remembered. So HIV/AIDS came to Hawaii in the 1980s. It came as it came to queer communities, every place, with great death and sorrow and tragedy. It was truly horrible. But Hawaii was different than any place else in the United States in that it approached the epidemic with a mixture of science and of common sense and of compassion. And that mixture really had an influence on the lives of people and provided an excellent model for public health, I think. Hawaii was one of the first places to have an AIDS service organization. It was called the Life Foundation. It was formed by Dr. David McEwen, who was also the first physician to have an AIDS case in Hawaii. And it was an organization that grew very quickly in response to community needs and began to provide education and counseling and medical referrals, and then to start working together with other groups like Gregory House to provide housing and the food bank to provide food. What's amazing about this is not just that it existed, but that it was actually supported by the state of Hawaii. And from the beginning, the state of Hawaii directed funds through the Department of Health, which allowed that organization to function as it did. This investment continued. The governor actually formed an AIDS council. This is at a time when the president of the United States, President Reagan, would not even say the word AIDS in any public announcement. And here is Hawaii making a governmental council on this issue. The government immediately began having regular reporting on AIDS cases, very important for epidemiologists. Another important point was that insurance companies were informed that they could not discriminate on the basis of HIV. And equally important, Hawaii was one of the places that did not pass laws to try to criminalize people for transmitting HIV, which really became problematic in a number of other places in the United States. There are two instances where the legal system and the legislature in Hawaii proved to be truly remarkable and quite different than any place else. And the first is in education. So the folks at Life Foundation wanted there to be information available for students in high school who are sexually active and they were beginning to see cases in younger people. The Department of Education dragged their feet, which is not terribly unusual there. But there was one of the nurses with Life Foundation who decided to develop a curriculum. And she did that. And then the Life Foundation contacted various private schools to ask about it. And Punahou said, yes, we're interested in that. So Life Foundation went to Punahou. It was a packed auditorium. The entire school was there. They did their curriculum, they did their training, and it was very popular, and they were invited back to Punahou and to a number of other private schools. Unbeknownst to the Life Foundation people, there were also people from the Department of Education there. They also were really impressed. And within the space of 6 months, the DOE developed a curriculum based on the one from Life Foundation, and the Department of Health helped to fund it. And they were teaching safe sex in Hawaii public schools at a time when this topic couldn't even be mentioned at most other places in the United States. So it was kind of an amazing effort. And they did it because high school kids were having sex, and if they had HIV or were susceptible, they needed to protect themselves. The other quite remarkable thing that the state of Hawaii did was that it recognized that the HIV epidemic, which had initially been confined to sexual transmission, mostly among men who have sex with men, it was beginning to appear in drug users who were sharing drug apparatus. And there was one outreach worker at Life Foundation who thought, you know, we should be giving people clean needles. And they actually started doing that at a place called the Rubber Room in Chinatown, where sex workers were able to sort of hang out. And they informed the police, and the police said, well, that's illegal, but we're just going to turn a blind eye. And then over the next 2 years, there was an intensive lobbying effort. And in the end, the state of Hawaii in 1992 passed a law allowing for one-to-one syringe exchanges for intravenous drug users. That was the first state ever to have state funding of such a program. And to this very day, Hawaii remains the only state in the United States where needle exchange is allowed. It's quite remarkable. And I think that it reflects a series of factors, which are the factors that we think have had some influence on the overall reception to and treatment of queer people in Hawaii. Part of it is political. The Democratic Party came to power in Hawaii in 1954, and it's never let go. And whatever you think of politics, the one thing we know is that if you're talking about anti-discrimination law, if you're talking about universal health insurance, if you're talking about health insurance for gender-affirming care, all of those things are within the Democratic political reign, and all of them have been prohibited, and in most cases are still prohibited by the Republican Party. So having a Democratic legislature and state really laid the groundwork and laid a foundation that allowed all of these other types of innovations to occur. Another thing that's very important is that Hawaii has a long history of sensitivity to civil rights, with good reason, because of colonization, because of plantation labor exploitation, because of the incarceration of Japanese people during World War II. There's been a real heightened sensitivity to the idea that everybody deserves civil rights, and that any violation of civil rights for anybody is a violation for all. And this is why you see groups like, for example, the JACL, the Japanese group, supporting marriage equality, even though it wasn't their particular issue, it was a civil rights issue. A third factor is the role of gender. Hawaii has been, relatively speaking, female power sensitive and strong since very early times. And in modern times was the home of Title IX, was the first state to adopt the ERA. It's always had a strong basis in female power. And that was critical, for example, for the marriage debates, because it was sex discrimination that ultimately decided it. And finally, there is a religious factor. You know, the the biggest enemy of gay people for the last couple of hundred years has been the Christian church. Hawaii has a strong Christian church, but they also have a very high fraction of non-Christian churches, including Buddhists, who are relatively tolerant and who in fact were amongst the earliest supporters of same-sex marriage. So that also has made a difference. And we like to think that all of those factors together have really made a difference for HIV/AIDS and for the lives of LGBTQ people in the islands. I wanted to sort of finish up by talking a little bit about the question of, we have these queer stories that are being uncovered. How do we preserve them? This has become super important with the last election, because we know that many of our histories are about to be erased from federal websites. They're about to be erased from many state sites, and there needs to be some sort of permanent protection. So one of the activities that we've been very interested in is in trying to erect essentially, hopefully this is going to work, physical monuments that reflect these stories. And the first example of that was, sorry, I started at the end. The healer stones at Kapai Mahu in Waikiki that honor these four Mahu who brought the healing arts. We added the city added a plaque to those stones, giving the full story about Mahu, which really had been erased since the 1940s. Another place is the Glades Show Club, the fabulous woman of the Glades Show Club. Now that original site is marked by a plaque. We're working on a plaque for Queens Beach, which was a very important venue for the gay community for a long time. Place where a lot of people gathered, did hula, played volleyball, made leis, and the site of the first pride parades for Hawaii. And I want to say that we're now very interested in marking Hawaii's AIDS history too. And recently we've been in conversation with the Life Foundation, now known as Health and Harm Reduction of Hawaii, which will be bringing the AIDS quilts from Hawaii back to Hawaii on this December 1st, which is World AIDS Day. And it would be really amazing if there were some way to have a permanent site of memory, a site of public memorialization, a site of remembering the lives that were lost to HIV/AIDS and to other forms of discrimination and violence over the years. So we've been working with the community and we'll continue that. There'll be a talk story at the Capitol Modern on December 13th for any of you who might be interested. And I have to say, I thought Adam's talk was especially intriguing because Kaomi is a really important historical figure. And so often he's seen either as a victim or as a perpetrator of bad things. But I think I see his story as a love story and also a heroic story. The idea that Kaomi was willing to give up his own relationship in order to save the power of the king, in order to save the kingdom, is one that really resonates. And so we're wondering, and I want to throw out the idea, that perhaps there should be some sort of monument or a memorial to Kaomi. There actually is a drawing that's believed to be of him. It was made by one of the missionaries back in the early 1800s. He's the guy standing with the kahili who's fanning his aikane, kuakane. And so we have some sort of picture of him. And the idea that we've been discussing is that to have a statue or a presence of Kaomi that would appear in one orientation as a solid figure of history, as a person, but as you change perspective, would disappear. And there's a statuary technique called parametric statues that would be ideal for that, that might be able to do that. And emphasize the idea that history really does depend very much on your perspective. What's been seen of Kaomi in the past isn't necessarily the only view of him or the right view of him, and that it's important to imprint views and perspectives of him into the public consciousness in a way that really can't be erased, can't be ignored, as our stories have been for so long. So thanks for the opportunity. As Bree has mentioned, the exhibition is up on their site. More of our histories are available on Lei Pua ʻAla Queer Histories of Hawaiʻi. And we'd love to have everybody who's listening contribute any stories, suggest stories that they think might join in. So thanks, Bree.
Thank you so much, Dean. And I want to, I invite all of our panelists to join back on the screen. I want to mahalo Lance, Adam, Karen, Dean for packing so much into this hour. It's just one of a continuation of series we hope to have to bring awareness to the exhibit and the work of Lei Pua ʻAla and all of the histories that we've shared today. So again, we encourage you to either come visit us in person or check out the panels in more depth online. We did get one question, I know we're a bit over time, but we got one question just about, in the context of the history of support for gay and queer communities, regarding the recent election and possible changes in administration. How are our panelists feeling about the ability of, at least locally, protection staying in place for our Moho community, and just sharing a bit of hope, I hope, as many people navigate the changes for the administrations coming up. If anyone would like to comment on that, please do. Otherwise,
Yeah.
I'll just say
Sorry.
that in Hawaii, we feel safe because of our history. And I'm really hoping Hawaii will be a refuge state, potentially. But I have to say, even in Hawaii, we're beginning to see the sort of horrible rhetoric that's coming out of places on the continent. And even though the people raising them have no chance of a hearing or anything, just to have people saying you shouldn't say gay in school, or just to have people saying there are only two genders and everything else is false, is something that can help empower people that have bad ideas and want to do bad things to our community. So I think it's really important now more than ever to be visible and to let things ring out. And Lance, maybe you can talk about that legal situation.
I think that anything that's based on federal law is open to reinterpretation, and anything that's based on state law is probably also open to reinterpretation if you can find a federal nexus. So as Bianca Isaki always says, one of the easiest ways to get out from under the precariousness of the United States is for Hawaii to be independent. So that is one of the solutions. If the recent federal election is seen as a problem, that might be one of the solutions.
If I can add real briefly, I hope that people will go and get Pukui's book, Nana Ike Kumu, Volume 2. And the quote is from page 98, but there's a whole section on sex. And Dina's nodding. It just gives you a totally different perspective on what we should be mad about. And honestly, who loves who is, in my opinion, shouldn't be one of those issues. Having said that, I'm very concerned about the current political climate on the mainland, of course. I think Molokaʻi has something to offer a little bit, because when I first came to Molokaʻi here in 1981, when the Earth's crust was cooling, the plans were to have 30,000 people living on the west end of this island. And everybody was hell-bent to do it. And today, if you were to visit, you don't see 30,000 people on the west end, let alone thousands of hotel rooms on the east end. And the ownership of land here on this island is like 5%. Only 5% of the land here is owned by people who actually live here. And so why in the world was Molokaʻi able to withstand this tidal wave of, capitalist aggrandizement? And I really believe it's because everybody just got together and said, we're going to hold hands and we're going to say no. And it has for many, many years. So if we kind of transpose that into this bizarre political period that we're in, I don't know if you guys remember Kenny Brown, but he was a politician and, you know, became quite a wise elder. And I remember being at a meeting one time when people were asked, you know, how do you unite people? And he was just sitting there. He was very old at the time. So he wrote on his little cocktail napkin. And then when it came time for him to share, he said 2 words, common enemy. So, you know, nationally right now, I see that the focus has somewhat shifted from gay to trans because gay is more acceptable now. So for me, at least, oni pa'a, the models of our ali'i, oni pa'a, ho'omau, you know, hang in there, you know, don't backtrack and hold hands. That's critical. This island would be different if people had not decided, you know what, we don't want this, so we're gonna say no. So, and Lance, the minute you figure out how we can do sovereignty, I'm in.
Again, thank you so much for the incredible insight and history shared here today. I hope everyone has a wonderful afternoon and week. The recording will be up tomorrow on our YouTube page for you to revisit these topics and share it to all of your networks. So thank you again, and everyone take care.
Mahalo.
Aloha.
Aloha.